I was catching up with an old colleague recently. Let's call her Elena. And she's that specific type of person. You know the one.
Oh, I think I do. The perpetual fixer.
Exactly. The one who stays late to correct other people's spreadsheets. The person who apologizes when someone else bumps into her.
Right. Her entire identity is built around being the most accommodating person in the room.
For years, that was her. But this time, when I saw her, she just looked completely drained, pale, shaking over her coffee. And she confessed she had done something she called terrible over the weekend.
And you just know it's not going to be terrible at all.
Not even close. Her family had planned this last-minute dinner. It required her to drive 3 hours round trip to cook for everyone.
Wow.
And this was right as she was getting over the flu. For the first time in maybe a decade, she didn't just smile and agree. She said, no, I need to rest.
Good for her, but I can already feel the backlash coming.
It was, in her words, almost violent. It wasn't just disappointment from her family. It was a complete character assassination.
Let me guess the words. Cold.
Cold, ungrateful, and the one that just...
Yeah.
It cut her the deepest.
Selfish. Of course, the nuclear option.
And she was sitting there, eyes welling up and genuinely asking me if she'd turned into a bad person. She showed me the text, just a wall of guilt-tripping accusations. And the worst part was, she was starting to believe them.
That's heartbreaking, because she's the one who's been wronged here, in a way.
It was such a jarring, paradoxical scene. Here's a woman who has given away pieces of herself until she's hollow, and she's terrified that keeping one tiny sliver of energy for her own recovery is a moral failing.
Meanwhile, the people demanding her labor while she was sick felt completely entitled to it.
Completely. And it struck me then that what Elena was experiencing, it wasn't selfishness, not at all. She was experiencing the terrifying friction of what our research calls sovereignty. And the backlash she was facing wasn't because she was wrong. It was because she had finally stopped abandoning herself.
And that story, that profound, gut-wrenching sense of guilt and anxiety that comes up when someone chooses their own basic needs, that is exactly the central conflict we are diving into today.
Right. We're all conditioned to see a boundary as an act of selfishness.
We are, when in reality, for people like Elena, it is an essential act of self-preservation. And frankly, it's an act of self-respect.
So that's the mission for this deep dive.
It is. We're going to be leaning on psychological frameworks, therapeutic insights, and even cross-cultural data to draw a thick, non-negotiable line.
The line between what exactly?
Between destructive self-interest, the kind that truly exploits and harms others, and the necessary act of healthy boundary setting, which we're calling sovereignty.
Yeah.
Our mission is to unpack the clinical and organizational reasons why choosing yourself triggers such a powerful backlash, and in doing that, help you, the listener, redefine where that line truly sits. We want to move this conversation out of the murky, emotional realm of accusation.
And into the clear light of psychological function.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack this core conflict. Elena felt like she was morally failing. She genuinely believed she was taking something from her family just by resting. But all the research we've looked at suggests that feeling, that sense of taking, is completely misplaced. So we need a fundamental, almost clinical way to tell the difference between real selfishness and this sovereignty.
That's right. When people are stuck in that guilt, they're often using the wrong metric. They're focused on the other person's feeling, the disappointment, the anger.
Instead of the nature of their own action.
Precisely. To clarify this, we need to introduce what the sources call the simple test.
I love the clarity of that name. It really strips away all the emotional noise and the guilt tripping.
It does.
So if you're listening right now and you're feeling that guilt or you're worried about making a choice for yourself, you have to ask one question.
Just one.
Are you actively taking from others, or are you simply no longer giving beyond your capacity?
This delineation is everything. It is the absolute core of this distinction.
Let's break that down, because I think the fear lies in what actual harmful selfishness looks like. People are terrified of being that person.
And they should be. True, destructive, harmful selfishness involves action rooted in exploitation. It's an active violation of a relational or social contract.
Yeah.
It means you're getting personal gain at the direct expense of another person's well-being.
So we're not just talking about being rude or, cutting in line.
No, this is real harm. We're talking about things like manipulating a colleague to steal credit for their work.
Right, an active taking of something that isn't yours.
Exactly. Or hoarding resources, whether it's money or information or even just emotional support, while people who genuinely depend on you are left to suffer.
And the mindset behind it, it's operating from a place of, ego inflation.
profound ego inflation. You feel entitled to dismiss, dominate, or lie to others because you genuinely believe deep down that your needs supersede theirs. There's a fundamental lack of regard for their reality.
And crucially, the selfish act is driven by trying to fill some kind of deficit, right?
Yeah.
But it's an ego-driven one.
Yes. You're trying to fill a hole using external sources, praise, control, money, whatever it is, and you simply don't care about the damage you inflict while you're doing the taking.
Okay, so that's one side. Now contrast that with sovereignty, with what Elena did.
When you're practicing sovereignty, you are not doing any of those exploitative, harmful things you are not taking. Instead, you are stopping a long, slow process of self-sacrifice.
You're reclaiming energy.
You're reclaiming energy you previously gave away past the point of depletion. You are trying to establish equality in what has become a one-sided relationship. Or in Elena's case, you're just honoring your basic biological limits, like needing to rest after being sick.
That's a great way to put it. The selfish person demands you sacrifice your life to support their ego.
Right. While the sovereign person simply removes the life support they were providing to the other person's dependency.
And that reframes the whole situation. In one case, there's a cost inflicted by the taker.
A real, tangible cost. In the second case, the cost that the former beneficiary feels is simply the shock of realizing they now have to sustain themselves.
That's why the backlash is so intense, isn't it? It's not about the moral failure of the sovereign person.
Not at all. It's the existential crisis of the dependent system. The system itself is threatened.
Which brings us to what you called the clinical truth test. This seems like the most important piece of this for anyone who's wrestling with that guilt right now.
It is, and it's remarkably reliable. The test is this. If you are anxiously questioning whether or not you are being selfish.
So the very act of worrying about it.
The very act. If you are racked with genuine guilt, if you're worried about the morality of your choice, if you're calling friends to ask, was that okay? Did I do the right thing? Have I become a bad person?
No.
You are almost certainly practicing sovereignty, not selfishness.
But why? Why is that guilt such a reliable marker? It seems counterintuitive. Why don't the truly selfish people feel it?
Because the genuinely selfish person operates from a position of profound justification. It's all rationalized.
They have a story they tell themselves.
A very compelling one. They've rationalized their exploitative behavior, usually by minimizing the suffering of the other person or by elevating their own needs to a crisis level. I had to do it because...
Right. They'll get over it. Or they deserved it.
Exactly. They genuinely lack the capacity for relational guilt about the consequences of their actions. Because in their internal world, in their story, the victim deserved the treatment or the resources they took were rightfully theirs in the first place.
So it's a critical psychological distinction. The sovereign person is feeling too much empathy in a way.
They're hyper-empathetic. They feel so much for the other party, and that empathy is what fuels the guilt. The truly selfish person has insufficient empathy for the impact of their actions. So that anxiety you feel, it's proof that the relational balance matters immensely to you.
Wow, that immediately reframes the anxiety. So the guilt isn't a sign you did something wrong.
It's a symptom.
A symptom of violating an old, unwritten emotional contract. Let's talk about that contract. Where does that deep-seated feeling even come from?
It almost always starts in childhood. It's rooted in early experiences where what's called mirroring or early needs appreciation is lacking.
Mirroring?
Yeah.
What does it mean in practice?
It's when a caregiver sees a child's needs, validates them, and responds appropriately. Oh, you're sad. It's okay to be sad. Or you're hungry. Let's get you some food. It's the basic act of being seen and having your needs acknowledged as legitimate.
And if that's missing?
If a child realizes their family environment is unstable or emotionally demanding or just chaotic, they learn very quickly to suppress their own needs. They substitute them for the needs of the system.
You need the peace.
To keep the peace, to earn love, to feel safe. The unconscious contract is brutally simple. I will abandon my needs, and in exchange, I will receive the safety of belonging and approval. This creates a chronic, lifelong pattern of self-abandonment that becomes the baseline for what you define as good behavior.
So when Elena finally says no, that intense, overwhelming guilt is the sound of her brain screaming that she is breaking the foundational agreement that has kept her safe and loved for her entire life.
Precisely. The alarm bells are going off not because she's a bad person, but because she's violating a survival strategy.
And that realization leads us directly to the thinkers who first tried to rescue this whole concept of self-regard from moral judgment, people like Fromm and Abraham Maslow.
Yes. They argued that we absolutely have to stop conflating true destructive selfishness with healthy self-love, which they went so far as to term healthy selfishness.
It's just astounding that this taboo on selfishness, as Fromm called it, has lasted for so long. He was writing decades ago.
Decades ago. And he pointed out that Western culture imposes this moral injunction, this idea that any self-respect is a form of greed. We're taught that loving yourself is somehow narcissistic egoism, but loving others is the highest virtue.
Which creates an impossible dilemma. It traps people in a cycle where they have to feel guilty for any form of healthy self-regard.
Fromm Masslow's work, particularly coming from psychoanalytic theory, gave us the mechanism to make the distinction. He argued that the unhealthy, exploitative personality is driven by inner poverty.
Inner poverty, not strength.
Not strength at all. Their greed, their need to take from others is a bottomless void. They're fundamentally unstable because no amount of external validation or hoarding of resources can ever satisfy that inner lack.
So exploitative selfishness isn't an overflow of ego. It's a symptom of inner deficiency.
It is the ultimate manifestation of psychological instability. And Maslow built on this when he was discussing his hierarchy of needs.
Right, with self-actualization at the top.
Exactly. For individuals who are fulfilling their most basic psychological needs, the self-actualizing people's self-love isn't some frantic demand for attention. It's a stable, necessary foundation for everything else. They both felt that the existing definitions of selfishness were just insufficient. They failed to capture the self-respect required for genuine human flourishing.
So how do they define this healthy selfishness, or HS?
They defined it as the passionate affirmation and respect for one's own happiness, growth, and freedom. But here's the key ingredient. It has to stem from inner riches rather than inner poverty.
So it's about giving from a full cup, not trying to fill an empty one.
Precisely. This kind of self-love is stable, it's expansive, and it is fundamentally the opposite of the instability and bottomless greed that we associate with pathological selfishness.
And what's so compelling is that this isn't just theory anymore. The empirical data actually validates this distinction. Healthy selfishness isn't just benign, it actively correlates with positive psychological outcomes.
It absolutely does. Study after study consistently associates HS, this measured willingness to respect and affirm your own needs, with adaptive psychological functioning.
What did that look like in real life?
We see strong correlations with high psychological well-being, overall life satisfaction, and high self-esteem. And crucially, it specifically correlates with the self-liking facet of self-esteem.
Self-liking, as opposed to what?
As opposed to self-competence. Self-esteem has two parts: believing you're competent and capable, and actually liking who you are as a person. Healthy selfishness is strongly tied to that second part, genuinely valuing and liking who you are, independent of your achievements or external metrics.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. And furthermore, HS is linked to genuine pro-social traits. When you're operating from a place of inner riches, you aren't desperate for other people's validation.
So you can give more freely.
You give from an overflow, not from a vacuum. And that means your acts of kindness are more authentic, they're less transactional, and ultimately they're more impactful for the person receiving them because they aren't weighed down with the emotional strings of fear or expectation.
Okay, so if healthy self-regard is so adaptive, why do so many of us, like Elena, default to self-abandonment? Because it seems like we're not operating from inner riches, but from a desperate place of anxiety and fear.
Which brings us to the dark extreme of overgiving. Pathological altruism.
Pathological altruism. PA. It sounds like such a contradiction in terms.
It is, and it's a fascinating and disturbing area of psychological study because it challenges our most deeply held beliefs about virtue and goodness.
What is it?
PA describes those well-meaning, self-sacrificing tendencies that nonetheless result in unintended negative consequences.
Consequences for whom?
Often for the self, but frequently, and this is the surprising part, for the recipient of the help as well.
This is the paradox that makes that quote so unsettling. Altruism can be the back door to hell. It implies that good intentions are not only insufficient, they can actually pave the way for destruction.
The historical context can illustrate this on a macro level, even if the application feels very personal.
Okay.
The sources mention the historical support for eugenic forced sterilization programs. In the early 20th century, many people sincerely believed this was an altruistic action. They thought they were saving society or improving the race by eliminating what they saw as burdens.
So they were acting on what they felt were virtuous, selfless beliefs aimed at the greater good.
Exactly. But the horrific consequence shows that even when you strip out personal financial gain, Actions that are rooted in a compulsion to impose your version of good onto other people without regard for their dignity or rights can be utterly devastating.
That's an extreme example, but it really highlights the key point. The danger isn't the act of helping itself. It's the unchecked motive and the unexamined consequences.
Precisely. And that's how it applies to personal overgiving. On a personal level, PA is very closely linked to a well-established construct called unmitigated communion.
Unmitigated communion. Let's break that down.
Sure. So communion is a normal, healthy desire to be close and connected to others. We all need that. Unmitigated communion is taking that desire to an unhealthy extreme.
What does that look like?
It's an excessive, almost frantic over-involvement in the problems and suffering of others, and it's always paired with a complete habitual neglect of the self.
So it's not the same as just being a really good, supportive friend?
Not at all. The distinction is vital. Healthy connection involves mutual support and respectful emotional boundaries. Unmitigated communion is a self-neglecting compulsion.
Can you give an example?
Think of the parent who insists on doing their adult child's laundry, managing their finances, and handling all their emotional labor long after the child has moved out.
Or the friend who jumps in to solve your crisis before you've even finished explaining it.
Yes, and in doing so, they take away your agency. They insert themselves into other people's struggles, not out of calm empathy, but out of a deep internal need of their own.
Which brings us right back to Elena. She wasn't motivated by a pure, joyful desire to cook for her family.
No, her motive was entirely fear-based.
So the research confirms this, that the core motivation behind PA is actually selfish.
Fundamentally, yes, but it's a very specific kind of selfish concern, one that's centered on anxiety and fear, not exploitation. The person who is high in PA uses instrumental, self-oriented motives for helping.
Meaning
They give in order to gain approval. Or, even more powerfully, they give to avoid rejection, to avoid criticism, or to avoid being hit with that dreaded accusation of being selfish.
So their giving is a desperate, ongoing negotiation. It's like they're constantly paying an emotional insurance premium to remain acceptable.
That is a perfect analogy. The giving is a desperate transaction intended to manage their own deeply rooted social fears. Unlike the genuinely self-abandoned person who minimizes the needs of others, the PA individual hyper-focuses on others' needs as a means of their own survival and validation.
And this pattern has roots that go way back.
Oh, absolutely. It has very strong developmental roots. Clinically, PA is highly correlated with those early childhood experiences we talked about, where the individual had to substitute their own needs for those of the family.
So if a child grows up in an emotionally chaotic or needy household,
they learn that the only way to ensure stability or to get any attention at all is to become the indispensable helper, the one who doesn't need anything themselves, the good one.
And in psychoanalytic terms, if the child's needs were never properly mirrored, never seen or appreciated, or validated by their caregivers,
they internalize the belief that their own desires are shameful or that they're a burden.
That's a heavy thing to carry into adulthood.
It is. This absence of early needs appreciation creates an adult who has an exaggerated, though often unconscious, need for responsiveness from other people. They become ashamed of their own desire to be seen or valued.
Which leads them to be radically undemanding of others, at least on the surface.
Exactly. But underneath that brittle facade of self-sufficiency, there is usually this simmering anger and deep resentment over having to sacrifice so much for so little authentic return.
And that cycle just fuels the adult drive to overgive.
It does, all to maintain approval and avoid the terrifying threat of rejection.
Given that constant emotional labor, that internal conflict, it's really not surprising that PA is linked to some severe negative outcomes.
It is the strongest predictor of maladaptive outcomes in this entire field of research. We see profound correlations with depression, chronic burnout, and social anxiety.
And not just general social anxiety, right? It's specific fears.
Very specific fears. Fears centered on losing emotional contact, losing control, and again, that core fear of rejection. PA predicts negative psychological adjustment much, much more strongly than just being a communal or empathetic person does.
Okay, here is the truly astonishing part for me. The finding that really forces us to redefine what selfless even means. PA is strongly linked not just to anxiety, but specifically to vulnerable narcissism.
This is the finding that connects all the dots between the fear and the fragility. And we have to stress this is vulnerable narcissism, not the grandiose, openly exploitative type we usually think of.
Right. So what's the difference? What is vulnerable narcissism?
It's characterized by a pervasive need for admiration, intense shame, and a sense of entitlement that masks these deep, deep feelings of inadequacy.
Wait a second. How can someone who is constantly sacrificing themselves for others also feel entitled? That sounds like a complete contradiction.
It does, but it makes perfect sense when you see the transactional nature of their giving. The pathological altruist feels entitled to a specific return on their emotional investment.
A return like what?
Usually boundless gratitude, constant recognition, or sometimes even total control over the recipient's life.
And if they don't get that?
If the recipient expresses independence or just fails to show what they deem to be sufficient admiration, the giver feels deep shame, anger, and betrayal because their self-sacrificing self-enhancement strategy has failed.
So their internal logic is, I gave up everything for you, therefore I am entitled to your obedience or your gratitude.
Exactly. This complex emotional profile shows that their constant giving is fundamentally part of a fragile narcissistic defense system. They are using their apparent altruism as a mechanism to manage their own shame and to get the external validation they need to feel worthy.
Which is why when they get accused of being selfish, like Elena, the internal pain is so immediate and so intense.
It shatters the entire defense structure. The accusation hits the exact nerve they've spent their whole life trying to protect.
And the data shows this actually leads to harmful behaviors directed at the very people they're trying to help.
Yes. This isn't just an internal problem. When we examine the actual consequences of this excessive, fear-driven giving, the recipients often suffer.
How so?
PA is significantly associated with self-reported statements like, "My helping sometimes causes others harm." This isn't theoretical harm, it's tangible. It usually manifests as overwhelming, smothering, or control-oriented behavior.
And what's the most telling data point?
For me, it's this one. People often tell me to stop helping them because they are overwhelmed with my constant helping. The person high in PA cannot respect the recipient's boundaries. They can't hear the no. Because the giving isn't actually about the recipient's need. It's about the giver's need to feel valued, necessary, and safe from rejection. They are compulsive, and their compulsion often steamrolls the agency and competence of everyone around them.
This psychological landscape is obviously complex. But we know the judgment Elena faced, being called cold or ungrateful, is so heavily shaped by cultural expectations. Ideas about duty and self-sacrifice. So we look at cultural frameworks, especially the ones that really emphasize collectivism. Is it possible that prioritizing your own sovereignty is inherently damaging or non-adaptive in those societies?
That, Clorn, takes us into one of the most powerful and, I think, enduring theoretical frameworks in modern psychology, self-determination theory, or SDT.
And what does SDT propose?
At its core, SDT posits that there are universal, basic psychological needs for all human beings.
Universal, so across every culture.
Across every culture. Those needs are for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And the theory states that meeting these needs is essential for well-being, regardless of the specific cultural environment you're in.
That immediately challenges the idea of strict cultural relativism, where you might assume that the path to happiness is completely different in, say, Tokyo versus Toronto.
It does, and the most crucial controversy that SDT addresses for our conversation is the definition of autonomy.
Right, because in Western context, we almost always equate autonomy with independence.
Rugged individualism, separateness, going it alone. But in SDT, that definition is seen as misleading and far too limited.
Okay, so we have to clarify this distinction. If autonomy isn't just independence, what is it? How do we define it within this framework so we can practice sovereignty effectively?
Autonomy in SDT is defined as volition.
Volition.
It's the subjective experience of willing endorsement. It means feeling that your actions, your values, your choices are fully endorsed by your authentic self. You stand willingly behind the behaviors you engage in. You feel like you are the source, the owner of your own decisions.
The opposite of that is?
The opposite of autonomy is heteronomy, which means external control.
Okay.
When you act from heteronomy, your behaviors are compelled by external forces, pressures, rewards, coercion, or that deep-seated guilt we've been talking about. You feel alien to your own actions, like you're a puppet on a string, even if the action itself is something society says is good.
So an example, if my boss forces me to attend a mandatory pointless meeting, That's heteronomy.
Yes.
But if I willingly choose to work late on a project because I genuinely believe in its value and I want the outcome, that's autonomous.
Even though both involve working past 5 p.m., the action is identical, but the psychological regulation is completely different.
And this distinction shows why autonomy isn't the same as independence.
Exactly. Independence is just the state of not relying on others for support. But you can be, for instance, autonomously dependent on a supportive partner or a network of friends.
Meaning you willingly choose to rely on them because you trust and endorse that relationship.
Precisely. Conversely, you can be non-autonomously dependent, forced to submit to an authority or guidance against your inner will, and that just drains your well-being. So autonomy is about the inner source of the action, not the social label we put on it.
Which means, and this is huge, a person living in a highly collective environment can still achieve personal sovereignty.
They absolutely can, provided they genuinely internalize and endorse the collective values.
And the data backs this up.
It's the core finding, and it's profoundly important for understanding human flourishing. Cross-cultural studies, and we're talking diverse populations, from South Korea and Turkey to Russia and the United States, they all confirm that the experience of autonomy is positively related to well-being. And critically, this relationship is not dependent on cultural membership. The power of internal volition is universal.
I find this so fascinating. So it means that whether you are performing a highly individualistic behavior, like starting your own business, or a highly collectivistic one, like caring for an elderly relative.
Your well-being hinges on how you regulate that behavior.
Not what the behavior is.
Exactly. The research is crystal clear. The more autonomous the regulation is, the more fully internalized and endorsed the action is, the greater that person's psychological well-being will be. Autonomy is about how you adopt a value, not what the value is.
So if an individual in a collective society genuinely identifies with, integrates, and believes in the value of, say, family duty.
They are highly autonomous. They are performing that duty because they willingly choose to endorse it, rather than performing it because they must to avoid being shamed or pressured.
Okay, if the well-being benefit of autonomy is universal, then why are some cultural expectations so much harder to manage, so much harder to internalize? This takes us right back to Elena's situation, where that family pressure just felt like an impossible burden.
This is where the researchers introduced another dimension. They looked beyond just individualism versus collectivism. They added the vertical versus horizontal dimension.
Vertical versus horizontal, what does that mean?
The vertical dimension supports hierarchy, subordination, and unequal power relations. Think of a top-down structure. The horizontal dimension supports equality and shared decision-making, more of a collaborative structure.
And what did they find about how easily we can internalize practices from these different dimensions?
They found a very significant hurdle. Not all cultural practices are equally easy to internalize. The vertical dimension practices that compel submission or adherence to a hierarchy was consistently harder to assimilate autonomously than the horizontal dimension.
That makes intuitive sense, but let's make it practical. Can you give an example of a vertical cultural practice versus a horizontal one?
Sure. A horizontal collectivistic practice might be a neighborhood communal effort. Everyone contributes equally based on their ability. Decisions are made by consensus, like cleaning up a shared park, because everyone willingly identifies with the value of community.
Okay, that feels good. What's the vertical version?
A vertical collectivistic practice is often enforced by a rigid hierarchy. For example, a strict, unquestioning adherence to the decisions of a family patriarch or a corporate superior, where your personal volition has to be routinely subordinated to their positional power.
The first example feels intrinsically rewarding. The second feels compulsory.
Which aligns perfectly with the concept of heteronomy.
Right.
The analysis is that vertical social arrangements are inherently more conflictual with our basic psychological needs for autonomy and relatedness. They often compel individuals, especially those lower in the hierarchy, to subordinate their inner desires to these external heteronomous influences.
So you act out of obligation or fear of punishment or the pressure of being shamed, rather than from genuine endorsement.
Exactly. And when behavior is performed primarily because of those external pressures, it is poorly internalized and it consistently detracts from your well-being. This was starkly evident when the researchers examined the data for women across these diverse cultures. Traditional vertical roles, which often mandate self-sacrifice and obedience to an external authority, placed a demonstrably higher psychological burden on the individuals trying to fulfill them.
Because the actions were inherently difficult to volitionally endorse. They felt forced.
They felt forced. So the key to well-being isn't to throw off your culture or your family structure. It's to find ways to choose what you do, even within those structures. But that choice, that shift to sovereignty, it still invites incredible resistance.
Right. Let's transition now to where this resistance plays out most acutely in systems that have come to rely on our overfunctioning. We started with Elena's family system, but we see this just as clearly in the professional world.
Every day.
Let's think about that anecdote of Marcus, the tech worker. He wasn't just a good employee. He was the organizational hero. For years, he was that quintessential rock star.
One who fixes the servers on Thanksgiving.
On Thanksgiving, takes calls at 3 a.m., willingly works every weekend without a single complaint. He was rewarded and praised constantly for this pattern of severe overfunctioning.
So Marcus was demonstrating classic pathological altruism, just transferred into a professional setting. He was using excessive self-sacrificing labor as a way to manage his anxiety, gain that rock star approval, and avoid the criticism of not being a team player.
And the organization just created this positive feedback loop for him.
Of course they did. The more he sacrificed his personal life, the more praise and validation he received. And that just reinforced the idea in his head that his worth was tied directly to his constant availability.
But the organization, from their perspective, had essentially become addicted to his lack of boundaries.
That's a great way to put it. They calculated his free labor into the business model. His manager probably realized they didn't need to hire a swing shift technician because Marcus would always pick up the slack.
So the company's efficiency metrics, the manager's bonus.
The whole team's sense of security, it was all being financially and emotionally subsidized by Marcus's self-abandonment.
So when Marcus finally chose sovereignty, when he started reverting to his actual contract terms, stopping the overfunctioning, enforcing a strict 9-to-5.
He wasn't just making a scheduling change.
He was initiating a full-blown system disruption.
And it was absolutely perceived as a betrayal. When he reclaimed his time, the system, which was totally dependent on his sacrifice, immediately misinterpreted his action.
How did the manager react?
The manager, who was used to his boundless energy, noted in his review that Marcus now lacked dedication and seemed self-centered about team goals. The praise stopped overnight. The perception flipped from rock star to problem.
But he was just doing his job, the job he was hired for.
Exactly. The central conflict here is that the system wasn't judging his performance within his contract. They were judging the withdrawal of a resource they had come to feel entitled to.
His self-care became an act of professional betrayal.
Because it forced the organization to face its own structural deficits, the fact that they were understaffed or poorly managed, deficits that Marcus had been hiding for years with his pathological effort.
And this mechanism applies just as acutely to family dynamics. When Elena said no, her family wasn't just judging her decision to rest.
No. They were judging the withdrawal of the cooking, the transportation, the emotional management, the whole package she provided.
It's the sound of dependency losing its source.
That's it. And this brings us back to that inevitable emotional backlash, whether it's at home or in the office, that dreaded "you've changed" accusation.
Right.
When you shift from chronic self-abandonment to prioritizing yourself, the people who benefited from your old pattern feel destabilized, and they react with anger and projection.
So the label of selfish in this context is often just pure projection?
It's the sound of their discomfort, their shock, because the energy source they relied on is now prioritizing its own health and sustainability.
And we have to revisit the internal mechanism that makes this transition so agonizing for the person who's actually setting the boundary.
Yes. The guilt and anxiety are so intense because that unconscious agreement we talked about, I will abandon my needs, and in exchange I will receive belonging and approval, is being fundamentally violated for the first time.
Sovereignty shatters that emotional contract.
It does, and the person setting the boundary now faces two simultaneous fears. The external fear of rejection, being branded cold or selfish, and the internal fear of the unknown. Who am I if I am not the fixer?
And the emotional response is so complex. It must be a mix of grief for that old, dependent, safe but draining system.
And hopefully relief. Relief at finally honoring their inner truth.
So given this really intense relational dynamic, how can a person navigate that backlash without immediately retreating into the old pattern? You can't just clinically explain psychological mechanisms to your demanding family members.
No, you can't. Communication is absolutely critical here. And the sources provide some good strategies for setting boundaries that were firm, but framed in a way that minimizes the perception of antagonism.
especially in environments that really value interdependence, like a close family or a team-oriented workplace.
Especially then, you have to avoid framing self-care as self-indulgence because that just immediately confirms their accusation of selfishness.
So what's the key?
The key is to frame the boundary as preventative and sustainable. You have to emphasize the long-term health of the relationship or the system. You're not saying, I care about myself more than you.
You're saying, I have to preserve myself to maintain my commitment to you.
Exactly. For example, if you're struggling with a colleague who constantly delegates upwards to you instead of a sharp, no, I won't do that, that's your job.
Which would be very satisfying in the moment.
Very, but not effective long term. Instead, you use the sustainability framework. You say, I'm unable to take that on right now because prioritizing the deadline on Project X is essential for the team's success this week. If I take on your task, I compromise our shared priority.
You align your personal boundary with the collective goal.
You do. Now, what about in the family context? Let's go back to Elena.
Okay. Emotions are running much higher there.
Much higher. So the framing needs to be compassionate, yet very firm. Instead of just saying, I can't drive 3 hours to cook because I need to rest, which just invites that moral judgment.
Elena could reframe it. How?
She could say, I need this time to fully recover so that I can be 100% present and reliable for the family next weekend. Or, I'm choosing to rest now as a commitment to my long-term health because I value our connection and I need to make sure I don't burn out completely.
That approach uses the language of commitment and sustainability.
It sends the critical message. I am not abandoning you. I am preserving the resource, which is me, that is required to sustain our connection over time.
That completely reframes the definition of compassion. It's not about infinite, limitless giving.
It's about sustainable presence. This aligns perfectly with research on compassionate goals, which confirms that truly healthy ecosystems are built on goals that are good for the self and good for others simultaneously. Any act that requires you to sacrifice your own well-being for the sake of others is, by definition, unsustainable and cannot be genuinely compassionate.
So this deep dive it's fundamentally redefined the friction that we experience when we try to claim space for ourselves. That painful feeling when you set a boundary, it's rarely about morality.
It's about movement.
It's the necessary turbulent journey from being compliant or heteronymous, acting based on external pressures and old guilt,
to being sovereign, acting from a place of inner volition and genuine self-respect.
And this movement is universally supported by the psychological evidence we've been looking at. True self-care is not a luxury.
No, it is a defining characteristic of a healthy emotional ecosystem. It's necessary for sustained well-being and for genuine compassion towards others. We've established that true selfishness is actively taking from others for your own gain.
Right, and pathological altruism is giving beyond your capacity out of fear and anxiety.
A self-sacrificing behavior that paradoxically harms the giver, and very often the recipient as well. The goal, which is confirmed by self-determination theory across incredibly diverse cultures, isn't to live independently of others.
We're fundamentally relational beings. We have that basic universal need for relatedness.
We do. The true goal is to be the volitional owner of your own decisions and your own commitments. That inner feeling of authentic endorsement autonomy, that is the quiet, consistent driver of well-being across all human experience, whether your commitment is to your personal recovery, your family, or your community.
So for everyone out there who feels like Elena, shaking over her coffee after saying a necessary no, remember the clarity of this research. Your sovereignty is not cruelty. Your boundary is not a betrayal. You are not selfish for choosing yourself or for setting necessary limits. You are simply establishing self-respect and moving toward a sustainable and authentically valuable life.